Hello again, and welcome to another Overwatch League team preview. This one will be about the Dallas Fuel, formerly known as Envy. Joining me is Reinforce, who has done things like travel to Korea to compete in Apex alongside of Envy, so he should know this team pretty intimately as well as having been on the contenders desk for all of Season 1. So he's seen many games of the Dallas Fuel, formerly known as Envy, and this is a team that comes in with pretty damn high expectations. Probably the highest of any of the Western based teams, even though, of course, they do have some Asian players such as Effect from Korea and Mickey from Thailand. But this is a team that basically did the impossible. They won a tournament in Korea. They were the first Western team to ever accomplish that. They repeatedly made the playoffs in their seasons of Apex. They made it to the top 8 in Season 2. They made it to the top 4 in Season 3. So they have repeatedly demonstrated that they are capable of hanging with the best teams in the world. And so I think most people are thinking like a top 4 finish for this team is pretty likely at the end of the season. So let's talk about Envy / the Dallas Fuel. When you think about Dallas, when you watch them play, how would you describe this team's play style, Mr. Larson?
I'd say they're one of the more passive teams. Would you agree with that? I'd say
Yeah.
that they like to play the control matchup. And it comes down to their tank play, I'd say, from Coco. Coco has been one of the more passive Reinhardt and Winston players throughout Overwatch. And so that has really helped them because that gives room for Taimu, who's a fantastic hit scan player. And as well, of course, now Effect, who can just deal so much damage while Envious has sat back and essentially just teared up the enemy team without much effort, I'd say, aggressively.
Yeah, and this is a team too that has when we think about Dallas, they've been really intelligent because historically, like you say, they have been a passive team. They have had certain weird hero pool limitations previously, such as the inability, basically complete inability to play Genji for a
Yeah.
long time, the basically complete inability to play Pharah for a long time. So they were cranking out top tier performances under because they are very creative. They will run their own strategies, and it is very difficult to figure out how to beat them because you can never practice against a team that plays as crazy shit like they do. They are the team that's very innovative, and instead of they're good at using the players they have to craft new, surprising strategies that are effective rather than trying to shoehorn their players into heroes that don't fit their playstyles, which I think is like the biggest thing we can say about this team.
Yeah, and their coach Kai has been probably one of the most innovative coaches to date in Overwatch, I'd say, because he's essentially the mastermind of this team, I'd
Hmm.
say, who has been bringing out all these strategies, and then the envious lineup, the players actually execute it so well because they're so individually skilled, and everyone can play their position to such an extreme. But Kai, in many ways, is perhaps the best coach in the West. I'd say. Would you agree
I
with
think
that?
that's probably fair. He was also, for those of you who are unfamiliar, he was the coach for the Team USA World Cup squad, which I
Yeah.
think exceeded everybody's expectations by a significant amount.
Yeah. So this team really just has all-star players in pretty much every position, and then they have the best coach in the West. And as a result, they've perhaps been the best team in the West in Overwatch history.
Yeah, but they never really. And here's the weird thing: is that they never really played the dive meta when the dive meta was popular, but they were still winning all of their games in the dive meta, especially in contenders against the Western rosters. If you are looking for a Western team that actually has a legitimate shot at winning the Overwatch League, this is probably the team for you.
Yeah.
They've got fantastic personalities on this team. They're very charismatic, very likable. And if you appreciate innovative strategies, then this is also going to be a team that will not disappoint you. They are really fun to watch for a lot of reasons. So
Yeah.
let's go into the individual players. So let's start actually with talking about sort of the core roster. Let's talk about the players who have been on this team the longest. Um, and just for people who are new, this is a team that put together, I believe it was a 56 match win streak
Yeah.
um, online in the very early days of Overwatch. It was something absurd like that, very, very long. And these are
Yeah.
players who have been playing together for the last couple of years now. and have, as a result, built up a lot of synergy. So you talked about Coco a little bit. So let's talk about Coco. Coco's a Swedish player. He's mostly a Reinhardt player, tank main, who is known as one of the more passive tanks that we have in Overwatch.
Yeah, he's been one of the more passive tanks, and he's received a lot of criticism in the past.
Never from
most
you, though.
notoriously from me, never from me. Never. I've never complained about him. I think it was a shame he wasn't in the World Cup squad this year. I really can't believe they brought in Swoosh instead of Coco. But yeah, I mean, he's a fantastic player when it comes to that passive playstyle, and probably one of the best passive tanks in that regard. But they did struggle for a period, I'd say early 2017. Apex Season 2, I'd say they struggled a bit, at least in group stages.
Yeah.
Because of this, because they couldn't find their identity when they couldn't rely on this very passive style. And that was in the triple DPS meta as well. Were you going to say something?
No,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, so, but since then, I think under the guidance of Kai, because that was around the time they brought in Kai as the coach for Apex Season 2, I'd say that Coco has really improved as a player since then. His Winston wasn't the best back then, but since then, obviously, he's improved a lot. And I'd say he is willing to take more risks on his Winston. And as a result, they've always had a very solid frontline since then, and it really showed in Apex Season 3 and later on in Contender Season 1 as well.
So let's talk about what the passive tank style does, because Coco, when we talk about him sort of playing very slowly, very methodically, marching up to an objective with his shield up and the rest of his team behind him, it does open up a lot of protection for his supports, and it does open up a lot of protection for like mid-range hit scan players like Taimu and McCree. So he does provide a lot of cover for them. And also, one of the other things that's always been a strength of Coco's has been his ultimate usage, because his comboing with his teammates is really good when he uses Earthshatter. I mean, he's had like game-winning plays with Earthshatter.
Yes, and I've certainly felt the power of those.
Sorry about that. We had a little bit of a disconnect, but we were, in fact, talking about Coco's passive style, and we were talking about his ultimate usage and how you had been sometimes punished by his patience with his ultimates.
Yes, very painfully through the combos of Mickey, of course, with the Diva ultimate, which was really popular in Apex Season 1 when I lost to them in the quarterfinals, of course. So yeah, very good team synergy between Mickey and Coco overall with his teammates.
After you famously selected to play against them, and then you lost to them.
Yes, that actually happened.
You chose to play against them, and then lost to them.
We chose to play versus them when we were the best team in the world, and then the meta changed, and then we lost. Unlucky.
Okay,
very unlucky.
Another player who's been on this roster for a long time, or several players, in fact, but we'll go with their supports right now. So two of their supports, Chips Hyan and Harry Hook, have been on this team for an extremely long time. When we think about truly top-tier Western Ana players, Chips Hyan comes up. He's considered one of the best flex supports that we have in the entirety of the game of Overwatch. Amazing Ana player, also pretty passive, but very good positioning most of the time, very good sleep dart usage, and a good Zenyatta player as well. So he's been one of the gems of this team for some time.
Yeah, when I think of Chips Hyan anyway, I think of the Zenyatta play, because at the start of Overwatch anyway, before there was any Ana in the game, the Zenyatta was of course the best hero of his choice anyway. But then the Ana came into the game, and it really made him even better as a flex support. And most notoriously, I mean, we've seen the highlight reels of him throwing out sleep darts onto Genjis in pretty much, whatever playoff, whatever situation, he just managed to nail them every time. So mechanically, Chips Hyan is, of course, a very good flex support player. But then his awareness is also pretty much among the best in the world. So Chips Hyan is an all-star flex support player. And I'm just going to keep saying all-star in this episode, because when I look at the roster of
it's a great roster. What can you say?
I'm running out of adjectives. What can I say?
Well, and then over at the Lucio position is Harry Hook. Now, of course, he's a player who is interesting because not only is he a great Lucio player, but when they want to run single support, triple DPS compositions, he also happens to be a outstanding Soldier 76 player. Like, not just, oh, this guy can play Soldier 76, like top fucking tier Soldier 76. So in a team where sometimes they Taimu isn't the best soldier player, Effect isn't the best soldier. The best soldier they have is weirdly their Lucio player.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was sort of weird because I think they put Internet Hulk on Lucio for a while.
Yep.
And they moved Harry Hook over to the DPS role. And everyone was like, why is Harry Hook playing DPS? And all of a sudden, he has one of the best soldiers, of course. I heard a lot of his teammates say that his tracking was really the best part about it. And he sometimes struggled a bit with the rockets themselves. The rocket barrage, I think it's called. No,
the Helix rocket.
Sure. Helix rocket, yes. But then he moved back to Lucio, and everyone was like, whoa, we want the Harry Hook soldier because he was so good at it. And when you look at his Lucio, it's perhaps not one of the mechanically best Lucios. I mean, when I think about maybe Kellex from the Boston squad, I'd say he's a very mechanical support player, and Neptuno, etc. Harry Hook really isn't that good when it comes down to the mechanics of Lucio, but he has a lot of awareness of his teammates, and he's always helping out the right person. So you can see Taimu maybe overextending a bit on McCree, for example, but he'll always have Harry Hook there backing him up. And whenever the enemy team dives onto Ship Sergeant, Harry Hook is always there. So he has great awareness and shot calling abilities, and I think that's what makes Harry Hook such a good support.
Why Chipshagen is Swedish? You don't say J's in Sweden. Why are you calling him Chipshagen?
Because everyone does it.
No, it's Chipshagen.
Chipshagen.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's Chipshagen. You are also Swedish. That's how you say it. Stop intentionally saying the wrong name.
Yeah, well, I just want to make sure that everyone knows who I'm talking about. I don't want to confuse anyone.
It's Chipshagen.
And yeah. I'm not saying.
You have to say that one right. Okay. You're not gonna say Torbjorn. Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm gonna say Torbjorn.
Okay.
Torbjorn on broadcast. You see, it doesn't work. I gotta say Torbjorn. I gotta adapt.
But you're gonna say Junkrat, not Junkrat, right? Or Junkertown?
No. Junkertown. Junkrat. Is that what you want? What
sure.
do you really want?
I want consistency.
No, I want the D's with my J's. Okay.
All right. So we'll go to the last member of the classic. We'll call it classic Envious roster, which is Taimu, a player who is known for his insanely good McCree play, insanely good Widowmaker play, insanely good Roadhog play as well. It's probably his top 3 heroes that we've seen him perform at the highest level. This is a player who's very interesting, not only because of his crazy personality, but because he is a player who is game changing in one of 2 ways. Either he is going to go absolutely crazy and like win you a game, or sometimes he'll just have the worst positioning you've seen and just die randomly. So he's a very instinctive player.
It just so happens
and a
that
streaky
he pops
player.
More than he...
he's a streaky player.
But
his high end is amazing, right? His high end is absolutely incredible.
Yes, and most commonly you see the high end of that. I mean, he's always going to be on the highlight reel whenever he plays. It just sometimes in the middle of a game for a map or so, he'll just disappear, and it comes down to maybe effect to carry his weight. But I mean, like 90% of the time, he'll get frustrated and just start to Widow, and you get a few headshots, calm down, swap back to the soldier.
That's true.
Start running away from the enemy divers, because everyone jumps Taimu because he's so good of a hitscan player. So everyone targets him. But that just means that Taimu gets really frustrated, and he starts popping off on the Widowmaker, on the soldier, on the McCree. And then the Roadhog sometimes in tags.
Yeah, and he also sometimes plays Winston these days too, weirdly enough. I mean, that is something that's happened on
and he
multiple
likes
occasions.
doing it as well.
Yeah, he likes doing it as well. So it's not just something that his teammates are telling him to do. And when we talk about him being instinctive, he oftentimes, when you see him switch heroes, it's often because it's just about his own comfort. And he like feels that it's the right time to change something. So it's oftentimes not a call for that one of his teammates is making. It's like time is like, I'm going to play Widowmaker now. And he just feels like he's going to like pop off and carry the game, which he can do.
Well,
so
when you have a player like that, you need him to feel comfortable in what he's doing. So you can't really force Taimu to play a hero that he doesn't feel comfortable with. So if Taimu wants to play the Widowmaker, you better let Taimu play the Widowmaker.
It's just interesting because he's such an emotional, like his he relies on his instinct and his game sense a lot more than other players, which is fun to watch. Makes him a very fun player to watch. And so now we're going to go into some of the newer additions. So there is a logic to why we're going through the players in this way instead of going through them role by role. So Mickey was a player that they brought in during Apex Season 1 after they lost their projectile DPS player Tailspin, and eventually he ended up helping them win. So he's a Thai player who was brought in from Envy's encounter with him at the Overwatch World Cup back in 2016. And he's primarily a diva player, and he's a really good diva player, and he's very reactive to his teammates. He's definitely a team player, definitely tries to work around what's going on the roster and support his teammates in the best way possible.
Yeah, I mean, they picked him up from the full Thai team, Weed Time.
Weed Time, the legends.
Weed Time. Of course. And at the time, I mean, he was one of the very few players, I'd say, that actually played the diva at the time when diva became a really good hero in the triple tank meta, because not a lot of people were playing diva during Apex Season 1. But he came into the squad and just fit in perfectly with a pretty aggressive diva, I'd say. And he's just been teaming up with Coco perfectly in terms of synergy, I'd say, because while Coco is a bit more passive, Mickey is a bit more aggressive, and as such, the defense matrix pairing it up with Coco just buys so much time for the backline of Envious. And then of course, he's a morale booster, and that's what you kind of need when you have Taimu sad about everyone always jumping on him.
Mickey is always smiling. He is definitely sort of like the booster, the emotional booster, as you say, of the team. He is very upbeat as a person, very fun to be around, and always positive. So I do think that he provides a lot of emotional support for this roster as well. Recently, we've been seeing him play more Orisa with this team. There have been times when we've seen both main tanks, Coco and XQC, not playing in the preseason, and Mickey's there. Sometimes he plays Winston. So there's been a pretty big variety in terms of roles. And when we talk about Dallas Fuel, more than any other roster, this roster is very flexible in terms of the roles that they can play, or that they're willing to play at the very least, in a professional setting.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the time when you talk about players willing to swap up their heroes and maybe play heroes they're not necessarily as good on, Envious manages to find a way to utilize every player's way to play a hero. So, for example, when you see Mickey playing the Winston, they're really good at building off that. I'd say Mickey was a more aggressive Winston than Coco, and often you'd see perhaps Coco on the Reinhardt and Mickey on the Winston, which meant that Mickey got a lot more room to go aggressive on the Winston. And so Kai in that regard is so good at utilizing all of these players on the Dallas Fuel roster to make sure that when you need an aggressive Winston, you can put Mickey on it. When you need a passive Winston, you can put Coco on it, etc. So they always manage to find a way.
So the last player, or not the last player, but the next player is going to be Effect, who is a player that they added during their time in Korea. Effect was a player who was scouted by Lunatic High, did not want to play as a backup DPS, so accepted an offer instead to be the only Korean player on the Dallas Fuel. Some people would consider him the best Tracer player in the world. He is extremely good. He plays a kind of solo Tracer style. Like, he loves to flank and sort of 1v1 people in the back line. So he's a force of nature. But beyond his Tracer play, he's not just a Tracer player. He is an exceptional Zarya player at the same time. So Mickey is the worst Zarya, I would say, compared to the two of them, because Effect is so good on that hero. So it's another piece of depth. They don't have to run the Tracer. They can run things like Diva Zarya simultaneously if they want to with Mickey and Effect.
Yeah, and we saw them doing it out on Eichenwald even. So there's definitely been plans to build around that, I'd say for sure. During Contender Season 1, there was a debate for Effect being among the best players in the world. And I'd say that going into Overwatch League, he has a pretty good chance to actually solidify himself as the best player in the world, especially when you have all the best players there like Birdring, and then you have Prophet from the London team, of course. And when Effect is finally squaring up against all of these, it's going to be very interesting going into the first season of Overwatch League to see if Effect can really solidify himself as the best player in the world. Because he's so mechanically skilled, he can play a variety of heroes. And I'd say it's pretty unique. You brought up the Tracer playstyle, of course, that is a more aggressive Tracer. But I find him a bit more in between in that he doesn't take as many risks. And as such, he's a very reliable Tracer because it's pretty rare, I'd say, that you see Effect going too deep and end up dying, perhaps. So in that way, I'd say that because he's so mechanically skilled, he can flex to so many heroes, and he's so consistent. I think Effect is a very good nominee for one of the best players in the world.
I think you're right, and we're going to see a lot more out of him, fortunately, on LAN as the Overwatch League begins. And he's sort of the indispensable player of this roster as well. He's going to be the one that everybody is revolving around. He's the most consistent player on this very good roster, and they know that. So now we're going to move into the 3 players that have been added recently. So we're talking for Contenders playoffs, late in the Contenders season, and these are players that were added specifically to fill certain voids that this team had. And I think that this is really a testament to how good of a coach Kai is, because we're probably not going to see these players as much, but when we talk about Envy's historical weaknesses where they were performing at an extremely high level, even without some of the projectile DPS players or Winston players that other teams may have had, this allows them at least that versatility. So of course we're going to start with the big name, the streamer Seagull. I mean, we have 2 big streamers in here.
I thought we were going to say XQC.
No, we'll talk about Seagull first. So Seagull is in some ways a great player to add to this roster because what didn't they play? They didn't have the Pharah necessarily. They didn't have the Genji. He also is a good Zarya player. He also plays weird heroes like Hanzo and Mei, which he can specialize in. So Seagull fills a lot of voids that this Dallas Fuel roster would have had, and certainly a lot of the time in 2017 he spent streaming, but now he's been streaming a lot less. Obviously, knowing him as a person, I know that he's super dedicated to being a professional player, even if he wants to do that. That's like where his heart is, and so he'll put streaming as a secondary goal to being a part of this Dallas Fuel team.
Yeah, and there was a lot of question marks, I'd say, around Seagull perhaps a year ago when he was playing for the NRG roster, and they were performing pretty poorly, I'd say.
Really poorly.
Really poorly. Yes, okay, fair enough, really poorly. So there were questions about him just quitting pro gaming and perhaps move into more of a full-time streamer. And he did end up doing so actually for quite some time. But of course he wanted to play more than anything professionally. And so he waited for Overwatch League to come around. And I think this is really the perfect team for Seagull himself. He doesn't need to be a starter. He's not necessarily the most skilled player, I'd say, among the most skilled players in the league. But really what he brings to this team is that sort of control, more passive approach that I mentioned earlier that Dallas is playing. And he fills the gaps with projectile heroes, of course, that they haven't been able to play prior with the Genji and the Pharah.
He's also a very good Junkrat player, too.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen Taimo play Junkrat, but I still think Seagull is perhaps the better of the 2. I'm not sure if I want to actually go on a legend say that, but I suspect so. So I suspect we'll see Seagull on those 3 heroes mainly. And it's just really what Envious needs. And he brings that mindset as well that we've seen this team play throughout.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with you on that, and so we'll have to see. He's definitely going to be a role player. He's definitely going to be a niche player for this roster, but we'll see. Yeah. We'll see how they adapt to that. So we've got XQC. Now, XQC is another big name streamer that a lot of fans might know. He was on the Canadian World Cup roster that made it all the way to the finals, and XQC is mostly going to be a Winston, but he's also a very good Orisa now. So he's a more aggressive player by style, so he's a pretty big contrast to Coco. And we've seen a lot of good synergy in terms of diving in with him and Mickey in the preseason.
Yeah, and he's very confident about moving forward all the time. So we saw them bring out XQC more on the assault maps, I'd say, because then on offense, of course, you want a Winston to take initiative and find those setups and dive perfectly. So I think that suits XQC really well. And then on payload maps, you'll see Coco play a more defensively minded Winston, perhaps a bit more by himself. But I think we'll see XQC team up well, specifically on the assault maps. And then Control will see, because they brought out Mickey, of course, as you said earlier, on the Orisa. So we don't really know what they've got planned. But for now, I'd say, especially on assault maps, we'll see them coordinate more dives. Perhaps when Seagull is in play on the Genji, we'll see XQC team up with him.
XQC also, just as a contrast to Coco, is a much more vocal player. So Coco tends to be pretty quiet in terms of shot calling. XQC tends to be, if you've seen his stream, you know he will never shut up. So pretty big difference. Like they're like, I see them as very like polar opposite styles, which is fun to see on one roster. And we're going to conclude with Custa. And Custa is an Australian player who used to play on Fnatic. And interestingly, he dropped out more or less for most of Contenders, so we hadn't seen him in quite some time. But he's another super vocal player. Remember, most of this team tends to be pretty quiet. Like Chips, High-End, also very quiet guy, if you know him. Harry, very quiet guy. And they add XQC and Custa, who are two of the most vocal players you can add. So it definitely changes the dimension of this team. But it also insulated them, I think, a bit from being hit super hard by the Mercy meta when you had Harry Hook, who was playing Lucio. Not to say that Harry, can't play the Mercy, but having another flex support, Custis coming in on the same role as Chips, Ana, Zen, and he's made a name for himself as one of the best Moira players, actually, right out of the gate on the champion release.
Yeah, for sure. And Custa is just another really individually skilled support player. And as you said, I think he's essentially there just to fill the gap when Harry Hook can't play the Lucio as much. And we know Custa for Zenyatta. Perhaps he has a better Zenyatta than Chips Hayan.
Thank you.
However you want to say that. So perhaps we'll see. I don't think we'll see a lot of Custa actually, because you have Chips Hayan and Harry Hook, of course, which are very solid. But sometimes you can't play Lucio. Sometimes you maybe want that Moira. Which Custa has been a big proponent of. So it's a good backup player, I'd say. And given that he never really managed to solidify himself as a top tier player outside of perhaps second place at DreamHack Winter with Fnatic, I think he's very happy about the opportunity to play in this Dallas Fuel squad.
Yeah, I think it's a really good audition. So he's another one who just insulates them a bit. So all three of the new pickups do make them more meta immune in a way that they weren't previously, or at least give them options to play certain heroes or strategies that they couldn't. And when you give a coach like Kai those tools, even though it wasn't effective, we did see them running all three support players on Junkertown in their map against Mayhem. Like they're going to do weird stuff. I agree, but I'm just saying that these tools will be used. This is a team that isn't afraid of making strange choices or running unique strategies and trying to throw people off balance.
Yeah. And perhaps they struggle a bit. I'm guessing that what we saw from them in the preseason, it's probably the worst we're going to see Dallas Fuel perform throughout. Yeah. Because I think they've added so many players to fill these gaps that they're struggling a bit to find out who to bring on and who to sub on, depending on what you want to run. Perhaps there's just too much depth now, so you're not quite sure how you want to field this roster. But with time, I think they'll figure things out, and with more play time together, of course, bringing in 3 new players, that's hard ask. So with time, I think they'll just perform better and better. And I mean, I'm totally looking out for them to get top 3, maybe.
Yeah, they definitely. You can't. Excuse me. You can't say that they don't have a shot at winning this league. We've seen them at their top end before be able to defeat elite Korean teams. So they I think most people say probably almost certainly top 4, maybe higher than that. Possibly they could win.
Yeah, for sure. I think people are selling them a bit short because, I mean, that's hard to say from Dallas Fuel, but people are like, oh, you're overhyping Dallas Fuel. I mean, they're a bit overrated. And I don't necessarily agree. I mean, as I said, during the preseason, they didn't look as good as we know them to be. But I'm so confident that with time, they'll just keep improving. And maybe they'll lose maybe 1 or 2 games at the start of the season. Maybe they'll do some triple support Stratagan, which isn't,
Yeah,
which wasn't
yeah.
Guy's best. But with time, I'm sure that they'll perform as they usually do.
Yeah, it was funny. I was talking to Custa about that after the game. I was like, "What was the idea there?" And it's like, "Oh, well, we can flank around with all these flankers. Get Moira behind them on Junkertown." And he said, the only problem is that Widowmaker's a really hard counter to that. I was like, yeah, but you're playing on Junkertown where literally everybody plays Widow. Did you think they weren't going to
Yeah.
play Widow? Like, what? So it was funny, but they're unafraid to make that experimentation, and especially in preseason when they know they're not fighting for glory. They already are considered a top tier team, so they're going to be more experimental in those kind of matches, which I think is really fun.
I mean, they are a team that likes to have fun and
Yes.
just pick weird heroes just for the sake of it. And then they like to brag in the interviews about how it was tons of fun bringing out the new heroes. So you can expect anything from this team. I think they're a fan favorite, and rightly so, because they are a really fun team to watch.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me. That'll conclude our Overwatch League team preview of the Dallas Fuel. And joining me has been Reinforce.